And we are live. At least I sure hope we are, because I did that fancy thing with the trailer, and there's a very small possibility that you cannot hear us. But greetings and salutations, assuming that you can. And let me welcome you to a very special episode of the Saturday Podcast Live, because we have Brian McClellan. Brian, how are you doing? Oh, let me turn you up there. I turned down your sound when you were a backing track, and now you are a human. Beg your pardon. Sorry, repeat that for me, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you.
Wonderful. And how is that which must not be named, that which keeps us in the house, treating you?
I'm very fortunate that I don't actually have to go anywhere, and I can do my entire living from home. I even switched my online bookstore to so that UPS or the postal service just picks up all of my mail, and I don't even have to go to the post office anymore.
That is amazing. Well, folks, as you know, our topic this month is world building history, because our current challenge is the History Challenge. So we are doing the history of an organization, whatever kind of organization that is in your world, an empire, a secret brotherhood, a religion, and you can find out the full details of that at the URL of the challenge itself, which the amazing Secondhand Samurai will throw into the chat in just a moment. But I thought, so originally I approached Brian, I was like, Brian, we're going to talk about unpacking the whole of historical fantasy. And Brian, being very good-natured, was like, sure, that sounds like a great idea. You don't actually sound like that, don't worry. And and then I thought about it, and I was like, actually, historical fantasy is a really, really big super genre, right? So yeah, exactly. So what if we limited it to just Flintlock Fantasy, which is of course where Brian McClellan thrives, and he very graciously said that he would love to talk about that. So Brian, I've said it in the announcements. You guys have seen the Powder Mage trailer just then. I couldn't get the sound to work, so that was random epic backing music that it had. But you get the impression of the world. Brian, tell us just a taster of Powder Mage. What is it?
So Powder Mage was basically me as a very brand new author 8 or 9 years ago. Gosh, I don't even remember when I started that. Taking the French Revolution and kind of like Sharp's Rifles, the Sean Bean series, and also a very famous book series, and taking that and saying, what if I turn that into epic fantasy? What if I add magic and try to kind of create its alternate world, but use it as inspiration for an epic fantasy, and go from there. And I was fortunate in that it got picked up by an agent and then a publishing house, and it did quite well. So now I write full time.
Yeah, man, did it. And it was one of the wave of the first Flintlock fantasy books that came out, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah, it's funny because when I first pitched it, my agent and then the editor that we ended up with both said, this is like brand new. I've never really seen anything like this. You know, there's been gunpowder in fantasy before, but we haven't seen something that focuses on the Napoleonic era as influence so much like this. And then, much to my surprise and initial chagrin, I found out right after my book came out, Promise of Blood, you had the 1,000 Names came out from Django Wexler like 3 months later. And so clearly I was not the only person thinking about this sort of thing. And there's been a lot since then. I don't know if Powder Mage is the most successful, but there's been a lot of Flintlock fantasy coming out. And it's been kind of fun to see this subgenre that I didn't invent by any means, but I was kind of on the front of the wave, kind of blossom, and it's been really cool.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to get Brian on, because he really is, one of the founders of the movement of Flintlock fantasy. It is a new subgenre, and we're going to be talking about that more. Of course, this whole episode of the podcast is about unpacking the genre. What does it mean? What should you be doing? What should you be avoiding? and how to get started, which is always a question that we get, and a very valuable question. What are the good first practices when you're starting out? So let me introduce Brian properly, because I just sort of launched into conversation there, which is, I think, a nice way to start. Brian McClellan is an American epic fantasy author from Cleveland, Ohio, although he now lives on the side of a mountain in Utah, which surprisingly he's not getting out of very much right now, where he writes books and nurses a crippling video game addiction. His novels include the Powder Mage Trilogy, and you can learn more about all of his novels at brianmcclellan.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Brian T. McClellan. And of course you can go buy his books, and you can get some signed copies on his website. And as if Brian was not cool enough with all of those things, he also plays TTRPGs. Oh yeah! Brian, you can find as a cast member over on Typecast RPG, which is an RPG show with all writers. It's a writer, GM, Dan Wells, I think.
Yep.
And then a full writer cast. Who are the other writers on that cast?
We've got Charlie Holmberg, who writes kind of a romantic fantasy, very successful author. Dan Wells obviously is our DM. He's famous for actually young adult horror. He actually has a Netflix movie, I Am Not a Serial Killer, and that series is fantastic. We've got Howard Taylor, who is actually a webcomic, with Schlock Mercenary. We've got Ethan Sproat, who's an academic. He teaches science fiction and fantasy at a local university here. And we have Mari Murdoch, who is who does a ton of I just forgot the word for it, tie-in fiction. She works in other people's properties, does work for RPGs, and I'm blanking on who she's worked for. I know she has a book that I don't think I'm allowed to talk about yet. But she's done a bunch of short fiction and a bunch of content writing for various RPGs.
Very cool.
So lots of writing experience among the six of us.
Amazing. So folks, if that sounds like your cup of tea, you can go check them out, and I just saw the URL go into the chat. But let's get started with the main event. Of course, the question on everyone's lips. What is Flintlock Fantasy?
So I've been thinking about this a bunch since you shot that question to me this morning. And Flintlock Fantasy is kind of this, so genres and subgenres. Like, you have the big genres are basically categories that bookstore buyers can, the people that work at Barnes and Noble and Waterstones and places like that can say, oh, I want some more science fiction, I want some more mystery, I want some more fantasy. And you have some kind of long-term subgenres like steampunk or cozy mysteries or whatever that people can, kind of specifically jump into. Flintlock Fantasy is not one of those. It's not kind of a big genre. It's a subgenre of epic fantasy, maybe even a subgenre of military epic fantasy, in which kind of the set pieces tend to focus on big battles and big political machinations in a time period that is roughly 1700s, early 1800s.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean it is historical. Like I said before, it's all alternate world, but it's heavily influenced by our own time period. If you take standard epic fantasy, it's kind of a very vague medieval, which could fit into anywhere in like 1,000-year time period. But Flintlock Fantasy tends to fit into a much smaller range, where the flintlock musket was kind of the predominant form of warfare.
Exactly. Sorry, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
I would love for you to define for our users, because they probably don't know the term, what is a flintlock?
A flintlock musket. It's basically a mechanism in the evolution of firearms that allowed it basically took firearms from a thing that you had to have like a tripod, and you had to have like this really long wick that you would light. And I'm gonna get all the terms wrong because I'm not like a historical actor or anything, and I forget stuff easily. But it took it from kind of this thing that was used for sieges, big cannons, or for, you get off your horse, you set up your tripod, and you do all that stuff. It took it from that, and it basically it streamlined all of that into a smaller mechanism on the side of what is very recognizably to us a gun, and made it so that you can, instead of firing once every minute or two, you're firing 3-4 times a minute, and it really kind of changed the face of warfare, which is what's really interesting to people like me, who just, like I'm not a historian or anything, but I find history super interesting, and that period in particular is really fun, and really kind of, it's crazy how much things changed over the course of just a couple hundred years with the development of gunpowder and the mechanism we use to fire bullets, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And my follow-up question for what is Flintlock Fantasy was gonna be, what is gunpowder fantasy? Now I have a rider to add on this, which is that gunpowder has been a lot around, as Brian mentioned, for a terribly long time. It's about the delivery system of death, if I may use the term. That's what has evolved, and that's what is reflected in Flintlock Fantasy. It's this particular stage of technological development in the life cycle of gunpowder, delivered as an instrument of death, right, as a weapon. So there's this funny thing. TV Tropes, which is a fantastic website if you don't know it, calls it fantasy gun control, where it basically, in epic fantasy, gunpowder is just sort of removed from the equation very often. You see this in Lord of the Rings. It's a generic fantasy setting, but nobody's got gunpowder, even though Henry VIII had gunpowder, even though they had gunpowder way back when, in this sort of pre-Renaissance era already. It's sort of often erased.
You see that a lot. It's interesting because you'll get people that really like to deep dive into this sort of stuff will say, well, the metallurgy in lots of different fantasy worlds, the metallurgy supported here is totally, and they'll give you a number like, oh, it's more like 1400. And, you already have recognizable guns by then. Yeah. And so, you get lots of stuff like that. And that's why I said that epic fantasy kind of medieval epic fantasy tends to vaguely slot into 1,000-year time period, because you'll have when's the stirrup invented, and when did this come about, and so I tend to stick with the rule of cool for that, and fantasy authors that have come before me have always gone with that and said, yeah, let's just leave out gunpowder, it complicates things. You'll get things like the Wheel of Time, where you'll have a character on like a little side quest that explores the idea of gunpowder and using it in warfare, and it's all this exciting development inside the world. But for my own stuff, I just skipped that and said, okay, gunpowder, magic together. Let's see what happens.
Sure, absolutely, and I'm not here to sell Brian's book, but Brian's book really is, if you're curious about Flintlock Fantasy and you want to read something, it is the perfect example of the gunpowder and the magic really coming together in a very iconic way, in terms of encapsulating the genre. It is the perfect example. But let's go to some other examples. Common examples of Flintlock Fantasy. Of course, everywhere I searched for this, because I always do a little bit of preparation for these interviews, Brian McClellan's book was right at the top. Everyone was like, well, there's Powder Mage, and then also, but what are some other examples? Games, RPGs, novels. Where can we find an understanding of Flintlock Fantasy from franchises or creative endeavors that already exist?
So I'll go a little broad on this, because like I said before, I kind of, Flintlock Fantasy in particular, I think of as this kind of little tiny genre of military epic fantasy. But I'll go a little broader and just talk about how kind of the gunpowder fantasy in general is used. The first thing I thought of was like World of Warcraft. You have like the dwarves they'll have like blunderbusses and muskets. rifles and things, and so we've been seeing kind of flintlock and gunpowder used as a fantasy trope for decades. Going all the way back to kind of early D&D. You could get yourself a musket, very expensive item to get in game, sort of thing, but you could do it, and it's always been kind of this. It's almost like DLC, like a little extra fun, expensive thing in game, rather than the focus of the world. And so you've seen it a lot. Every time I'm on a panel at a convention with Lee Modisett, who is a kind of an old time fantasy author. He's been around forever, and he's written tons and tons of books. Every single time I'm on a panel with him, he goes, "Well, Brian, I wrote an epic fantasy with gunpowder in it 30 years ago," and it's like, thank you, Lee. I appreciate that. That's fantastic. But you didn't build your career on it.
Right.
And it's always funny because Lee's fantastic, but he always gives me crap about it. So it's been around for a long time, but it's always been kind of a side thing.
What's been sorry, just to add to that, what's interesting to me is it's often used as a tone tool. So in World of Warcraft, that great example that you gave, the dwarves have gunpowder because gunpowder is and they have gunpowder activated weapons, right? The blunderbuss, the rifle, whatever, because
big
this
artillery,
is exactly. Thank you. This is the sort of shortcut for they are technologically advanced. Yeah. They have this next stage of technology that is close to other people. And actually in the in-game mechanics, I'm not going to admit to playing World of Warcraft here, but clearly I do. In the mechanics, they work very much like anything else. It's literally, it could be a skin. It could be a unicorn beam shooter as far as the game mechanics are concerned. It's literally a tone. And again, in Terry Pratchett's world, he includes a book with the Gon, which is a gun. And it's seen as this sort of terrifying technological invention, from the perspective of this medieval world. So I think that's often how it's incorporated rather than as a mainstay in the genre, as Flintlock's fantasy is.
Yeah. And, like some examples of people that are kind of working in it more these days. Like if you take, like Brent Weeks's Lightbringer series is a big epic fantasy series, very successful. I'm sure lots of people here have already read it. But he doesn't focus on it. I would have to ask Brent to actually get the year, but his inspiration comes more from, I think, the 1600s, early 1600s, maybe even 1500s. And so the kind of the gunpowder technology is a little bit older. I think one of the characters has like a flintlock, like dueling pistols that are like very expensive, like very advanced technology for the time. But it's all, I want to say, either matchlock or wheel lock, or are the actual guns in the world, which was what happened before Flintlock. And so, but he doesn't focus on that. He focuses much more on the magic system and how it works to kind of in combat and stuff like that. But that's a good example of somebody kind of advancing the historical timeline for their epic fantasy. Robert Jackson Bennett is one of my favorites. Robert writes kind of, he doesn't aim for a particular time period like I do. He aims for kind of, I don't think he even aims. He just wants it to be cool. There's some elements of steampunk in his books. His newest series starts with Foundry Side. Really good. I think the sequel just came out a couple months ago. And it is all technology that is, it's in that time period where they have weapons like that, but the magic system itself is very, it's all based on programming. So you would program a horseless carriage to move forward and to stop at certain points, and then it would just do it. That's kind of the magic system, and it's very cool. But the, like, again though, the actual warfare, the method of warfare, is not nearly as important as the magic system, which most fantasy authors, even working in specifically Flintlock Fantasy, they're gonna focus on the magic system. And my next series, the Godglass series, does the same thing, where I'm sticking with Flintlock Fantasy in that it feels very early 1800s. The world, the politics, everything about it, but the magic system itself doesn't have anything to do with the weaponry. Which I don't know if people are going to be annoyed with after, you know, kind of having made my career with Powder Mage.
Right, but it's a new thing. You know, you want to do new stuff. That's completely reasonable.
Right.
Somebody has mentioned, and this was one that I read as well, Naomi Novik's Temeraire series. What do you think of that as a Flintlock Fantasy series?
So I read
gunpowder.
I honestly, I'm not sure. I would honestly, I would just call it straight historical fantasy, which is a total
dragons in though.
No, but it is history. So it takes place in our world, and it's and that's kind of the dividing line there, because historical fantasy is very much a thing and has been around for a very long time, where you have literally our real world, and it tends to be very well researched. Everything is perfect. They've got the technologies all right, but it's literally our world, except adding something, adding magic, adding dragons. And I love that series. I think I read the first 2 books, and before I was even an author, I got to sit on like a little round table with Naomi Novik. She was super sweet, very cool, and I really did. It's a really cool series. But like I said, the difference is historical setting versus secondary world setting.
Those of you who have watched my the 3 times of world building video, which is about essentially the categories of world building, this is what we call alternate Earth, not second world or imaginary fiction. So it's just a very clear distinction. If it's real world, if it's got real world geography, if it's something that took place in our world and quotes real world stuff, then it's alternate Earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is a whole different kind of genre from what I do, and I specifically avoid it because I hate research. I don't like jumping down those rabbit holes of figuring out what kind of shoes everybody wore and stuff like that. That kind of just bores me. I think it's very I huge respect for the people that can do that and then incorporate it into their writing and make it feel real. I think that's so freaking cool. But I don't like having to do anything more than Wikipedia when I'm doing my stuff. And writing in secondary world fantasy, it makes it so that I don't have to. If I make a mistake about something, I can generally hand wave it off and be like, oh, the world's different. Magic, great, yay. Don't worry about it. Sure. Close your eyes, pretend you didn't see that. Whereas historical authors can't do that. They have to get everything right. Mary Robinette Cole, she writes, I had the name of her series on the tip of my tongue.
Sense of Honey and something or other.
Yeah. I have not read it. My buddy Dan Wells, who does the series, does the RPG with me. He absolutely adores Mary's books. And I from what I've heard, they're just incredibly researched. And they're just, it's like Jane Eyre with magic, basically.
Yeah, it's a lot like Jane Austen with magic. It's like if Jane Eyre and Jane Austen had a baby with a little bit of magic in there. It's sort of like comedy of manners with some illusion magic, essentially.
Right. And so you can go kind of anywhere you want when you're writing. The most important thing is to make it feel real to the reader. I talk a lot about that. It's especially for me, because I don't have to get those historical details right. Making it feel real is more important than having it be realistic. And that's sometimes, you kind of have the rule of cool, which is, ignoring like real world physics to make something sound awesome. Which is, that's everybody in here knows that. They know the rule of cool comes into term with anime and video games, and all of that is all rule of cool.
Right.
And so it's you can really do anything you want as long as it feels like it's real to the reader and to the characters that inhabit the world.
Sure. It's verisimilitude over authenticity, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I wanted, like Powder Mage, I wanted to be like Sharp's rifles, but I don't need it to be Sharp's rifles.
Right. It has that flavor, essentially. And that's actually a great jumping off point for my next question, which is common tropes of Flintlock Fantasy. Tropes are a really helpful way to understand a genre. They're a really helpful way to start thinking about how you might approach a genre. So what are some of the common tropes of Flintlock Fantasy?
Oh man, see that's kind of tough because it's such a kind of a young genre or young subgenre, that you don't really have tropes for it yet. I mean, just speaking from the few that I have, I mean, from what I've written and what I've read, you kind of like the big one is clearly focusing on the method of warfare.
Right. There's going to be battles. There's going to be talk about weapons because gunpowder,
yes.
flintlock, it's very, very important, essentially.
Yes. And you've got, I think, something that a lot of the tropes are going to be what comes out of that time period in our real world, what stands out to us. And those things would include stuff like the Industrial Revolution, and the world, not just the weaponry, but the world changing politically and technologically, and everything. You're going from kind of you're transitioning from the Renaissance into something else. Where more people live in the cities. Things are crowded. Things are dirty. Things are smoky. You've got something that stands out to me that I love writing into my books is military geniuses, kind of the great men, and you get that in all sorts of epic fantasy. But it really, you look at like the era of Napoleon. You've got these great men that just they command armies, but they also command empires, and they're like a force unto themselves. That's definitely that's a trope of fantasy in general, but I think it's very specific people like Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington kind of stand out for writers that are writing in the kind of Flintlock genre.
It's worth mentioning actually, because you mentioned it already with when you were talking about Napoleon and this Napoleonic era. So of course, the flintlock was invented in 1610. Like it's way older than the Napoleonic era. So when we're talking this revolutionary era, we're kind of sort of talking 1785 and onwards, that kind of space. And so 1785 to about what, 1820, I would say 1825. That's
1815, 1820.
That's the period that is iconically trope Flintlock Fantasy, even though you had an actual flintlock since 1610, because we're not talking about the 17th century usually. We're talking about the late 18th century, that is the 1700s, right? So that's a very interesting trope as well, is that there really is that focus on the later era.
Well, and I think that ties in with kind of what I was saying about the Industrial Revolution. You get mass production was huge for equipping armies with flintlock weapons. You have to, when you have to equip 60,000 people all with something that shoots and can have a bayonet fixed to it, that requires a mechanism of industry that hadn't been seen until that time period. And I think that's kind of what makes it interesting, and the political aspect, the kind of the revolutionary era, kind of people going from serfs or from, commoners,
Yeah.
to really, like the lower and middle class. And you've got a rising middle class of people that have no connection to nobility or great families, but they invented something and now they're super rich,
Right.
or they sold something and now they're super rich. And all of that is super interesting. That entire what we're saying, 50-year period, really, it changed the world in a way that hadn't been seen before. And I think that that's what's so interesting about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are all absolutely tropes of this time. I mean, I am a big old nerd and I do write historical fantasy. So I do all the research for the periods that I write about because that's what I love, right? Like
Hmm.
my parents are archaeologists. I was born in a trench. What are you going to do? Um, yeah, one of the things that is very interesting is that the 18th century is that time when they develop a name for the middle class. They call them the
Hmm.
middling sort, right? Or at least they call them that in England. And with this sort of rise in urbanization, I don't want to bore you all too much, but with this rise in urbanization and this rise of sort of education within the middling sort and a little bit more social mobility, a little bit more of the ability with things like the press to get information out about a new product, to get it patented and to get it distributed. All of a sudden, you do start seeing this sort of rise of the middle classes, this rise of great men from nothing, and the pushback of the nobility, which is, of course, one of the things that fed all of this revolutionary action as well. And I
Hmm.
think that's also that push between the classes, that fermentation of people people pushing up and people pushing down and all of that sort of social action. That's
Yeah.
absolutely again a trope of Flintlock fantasy, something that you see very strongly is people
Well,
re-identifying or redefining themselves.
yeah, definitely. And you go from an era where kind of people knew that they knew their place, I suppose you'd say, which is horrible, and I hate that kind of expression actually. But people knew their place, and they knew that they were going to, to grow up in a tenement, or in a mud hut, or they knew they were going to be a farmer. They knew they maybe might get apprenticed to somebody, that they could get a chance of becoming a little bit more successful from that apprenticeship. That was like the extent of upward mobility. And then you kind of get into this time period in which suddenly people are having these crazy ideas, like maybe the nobility shouldn't be able to crap on us all the time. Maybe we should, right, like maybe maybe normal people, their lives are worth something. That, and all these crazy ideas start happening and fomenting, foment, like you said, the printing press. I mean, people could suddenly, normal people that had even a tiny bit of reading ability could suddenly read radical ideas. They could suddenly read the Bible, even. But then they could also read, reactions to the Bible. They could read a scholar from 800 miles away might, write a treatise, in reaction to, what a bad action by a noble, and suddenly that little pamphlet could be distributed in the countryside,
Yeah.
for barely anything, no cost at all, almost. And that just totally changed things, and it changed the way people thought about themselves, the way they thought about the nobility, and so you have kind of those old families. That's how the revolutionary era came about, was that you have these old families that are incredibly wealthy and incredibly, set in their ways, suddenly saying, "Oh crap, there's people with pitchforks outside. What do we do?" Nobody's ever talked back to me before in 10 generations, or whatever. And it changes the entire fabric of society and the world. Um, and you have, along with all that, you've got the technology of weaponry, of flintlocks. We've got all this advancing, until you have these giant battles between huge armies, that are blasting the crap out of each other with artillery, and flanking each other with dragoons. And you've got, when does cavalry suddenly start not being useful anymore? or having to be used in very certain ways. Otherwise, they'll all just die. You've got so many things going on, kind of that just change it from swords, bows and arrows, and guys on horseback, maybe with lances, maybe with swords, whatever. You go from that to enormous battlefields with, some people are wearing armor. Most people are just wearing a cloth uniform, but carrying this little mini combustion weapon that they can reload relatively quickly. They can shoot relatively accurately. Once you get rifling, that changes things as well.
Yeah.
You've got you've got bayonets. You've got the plug bayonet, which you have to literally stick into the end of your weapon, and so you can't shoot anymore. And then you have the ring bayonet, which you just slide over and you click into place, and so you can shoot. You've got so much going on there that is really fun for a writer and a world creator to play with.
Yeah.
And it's a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of those really sort of bring together this amazing genre, essentially. So we've talked about what it is. What is Flintlock Fantasy? We've talked about what isn't Flintlock Fantasy, which is often just as useful when we're trying to define a genre, because of course genres are timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, as we all know. They're sort of non-entities, but they're very useful, but they also don't exist, right? It's this very strange space that we're discussing. So talking about what it isn't, talking about what it is. We've talked about some common tropes, which is often very, very useful as well. Let's talk about some common mistakes. These might be mistakes that you made early on. There might be mistakes that you see in other authors, or just general things that you think people should avoid or might have a tendency to do when they start creating Flintlock Fantasy, or when they're writing it,
I think the biggest mistakes are, so I talked a bit about me not wanting to research. But you do have to do a certain amount. You do have to nail some things down. If you are writing Flintlock Fantasy, you need to know the general drills. What somebody who's firing a musket actually does to fire the musket, because it's more complex than a bow and arrow. You don't just draw and fire. You have to do several different things. You have to keep your weapon clean in between those things. You have to know how the technology works and what the terms are. Promise of Blood, I got by on that with a lot of enthusiasm. I make some small mistakes that I've only been called out on once or twice by historical reenactors, and that was where my kind of hand wavy, oh, it's magic could come into place. But I would prefer to have not made those mistakes in the first place. Because, it's fine that I only got called out a couple of times. I'd rather not get called out ever.
Wouldn't we all?
So, right. So doing that basic research is very important. And learning about the time period. The time period is so complex, and in those 50 years, so much happens, that there's a reason why kind of medieval epic fantasy authors can just kind of do whatever they want that kind of fits into a very wide range of time, but that doesn't really work for kind of Flintlock Fantasy authors. There's so much going on. You need to have a basic grasp of the complexities of the time period. Whereas if you're writing normal epic fantasy, you don't need to know about 1230 to 1280. You don't, there's nothing as specific that you really have to grasp.
So what's funny actually about that is that there's absolutely as much going on, but the general reader does not know about it, which means you do not need to get it right. So this is about knowing your audience and knowing what your audience knows about. I know this because I just gave my medieval fantasy book to my sister, who is a senior lecturer in medieval history. And oh my gosh, what an alpha reader to have. I mean, completely pulling stuff apart, which is fantastically useful. And then I can look at that through a pinch of salt, through through a careful eye and say, okay, well, normal people will know this.
Yeah.
Normal people will not know that. But yeah, there is absolutely a reason they call it the long 18th century. There is a lot going on in the 18th century.
Well, and like you said, like in you know, like 1200, lots of stuff happened. There's just as many events going on. You know, machinations and overthrowing and wars and naval battles, all sorts of stuff is happening. But when you jump forward to the time period we're talking about, that's when you get the technology changes and the social upheaval that did not exist beforehand.
Yeah.
Or that if it did exist, it was on a much slower, long-term sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's one of my favorite podcasts is the Revolutions podcast, and they just talk about revolutions, historical revolutions, and it's so great. It's one of those things that I wish I had listened to the Revolutions podcast before I wrote Powder Mage, but of course then Powder Mage might have been a super boring political treatise rather than a big epic war-filled sort of thing. So that's a fantastic one. Another one that I love is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. And I think it's Dan Carlin who talks about, in one of his episodes, he spends a lot of time talking about how the armies of Alexander would have been very recognizable to the armies of the 1800s. Of the maybe more the 1700s, but like these would have been fairly recognizable armies to each other. But then once gunpowder is like very common, you have a psychological aspect, which is something we actually haven't touched on yet. Of one of the psychological aspects of gunpowder, it is that it is loud and that it is very smoky. And so this is actually a good trope that going back to your previous question, that you take battlefields. If you think of a battlefield, let's talk about like one of the big battles in Game of Thrones, the TV series, which nobody ever talks about anymore. But I think it was season like 7 or something. Mm-hmm. They had a fantastic battle between like two northern armies that really showed how disgusting and muddy and horrible it was. Take that and then deafen everyone with giant booms from artillery and smaller booms from thousands of muskets. And then you add the fact that nobody can see shit because of all the smoke coming out of the powder. And so add all of that on top of that battle from Game of Thrones, and you'll see that suddenly something that is already horrifying is now confusing and disorienting, and just it ratchets everything up to 10.
Yeah, absolutely. And so essentially that's you've given me two things there. You've given me a common mistake, which is not doing your research and not being able to tie in those things. And also you've given me a wonderful trope, which is make sure that you capture the realism of gunpowder. If you're using gunpowder, if you're using flintlocks, make sure you capture the realism not only of this, all of a sudden the the gunpowder is in the hands of the infantry, but also that it is loud and terrifying and deadly, And
I was writing a scene yesterday in which there's a small group of soldiers trapped in like the basement bunker munition depot underneath a fort, and someone else is mining in from the side and is about to bust through the wall of this basement. And everybody's standing there with their muskets, like bayonets fixed, ready to shoot and then stab whoever comes through that. And I was thinking about this morning, I'm like, man, I've got to remember that these guys would all be shoving wax in their ears to try to lower the sound from the shots. They would all be braced for like suddenly blinded by their own powder because it's such an enclosed space. There's all these details that I like that don't make it into my first drafts that I'm like, crap, I need to make sure I go back and include that stuff.
Writing is rewriting, people. The other little make sure you don't, so common mistake, that you actually gave me just now is make sure that you don't include all of your research in your book. So when you mentioned it's good that I didn't listen to the Revolutionary podcast before I wrote Powder Mage, that translates to do your research properly, but don't try and cram all of that research into your book just because you did it and you think it's cool. That's what World Anvil is for. Put it all in World Anvil so you know you have it, and then cherry pick what is useful, essentially. I guess that would be the lesson there.
You only want the top of the glacier, of the iceberg, to be sticking out, and that's what the readers see. You want kind of the shadow underneath it. You want that giant amount, hiding underneath the water, and you want the reader to kind of get a sense that this world is deep and rich and powerful, and that it could sink the Titanic. But you only want to be able to see on the page the top of the iceberg.
Sure.
And because otherwise, it's gonna be so boring to the reader. They're gonna read 3 pages of political treaties on like social mobility and go, okay, well, I'm gonna go find something else to do. So you gotta, even if you want to include really cool, interesting things like that, you have to cut 90% of that. The God Glass, which is my next series that I sold to Tor last year and will be out in probably 2 years, probably 2022. When I first conceptualized it, I had been listening to tons of Revolutions podcast, and I said to my agent, I really want to write a political thriller fantasy, and her response was, oh God, Brian, please don't do that. I'll never be able to sell it, and no one will ever read one of your books again. And so I dialed that back down and did mostly kind of Powder Mage, epic heroes, big battles, things going on, but with I flavored it with quite a lot more of kind of the social and political aspect of the time period.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so we have discussed Flintlock Fantasy for you. We have unpacked it. We've talked about the pros. We've talked about what to include and where to get started and how to find inspiration. And we've also talked about what not to do and where you might trip up. And we have made the mistakes, so you don't have to make the mistakes. That's what we do here. So I think it's time to answer some of your questions. Oh, I've frozen. How curious. I think it's time to answer some of your lovely questions. I have some excellent ones right here. Sharon Beatty asks, how much world building do you do for your stories?
Ooh, okay. I'll try to be quick on these questions. For Powder Mage, I did very little world building. I had an idea of what I wanted to do. And I just kind of plowed forward on it, and kind of I was very slapdash for the first book. The 5 sequels, the rest of the series, I was a better writer, and I was more strict about trying to keep things consistent. But in Powder Mage itself, I was really just throwing shit at the wall, and it worked out pretty well, and I'm very proud of that book. But one of my big regrets looking at Powder Mage is that I did not do more world building from the beginning, and that's something I'm trying to change with God Glass, my next big series. And so yeah, it's every writer is going to be different on world building, and it's all up to you. It's all your own preference as how much you do, but do enough that the reader feels like the world behind the page exists, that it is deep and powerful and interesting. Give them the bottom of the iceberg.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want more of that iceberg terminology and you want to know where that's come from, you can check out some of Brandon Sanderson's lections, which are on YouTube. He often talks about this. I'm guessing that's one of the places that you pick that up, Brian.
Yeah, Brandon's way better at this crap than I am. So Brandon's way more organized about this stuff than I am.
He
so.
has to teach modules on it. You don't have to teach modules on it. When you have to, the time will come. You will be organized too. Don't you worry. Sharon Beatty asks, are you a plotter and how many rewrites do you do? I think as a general rule, because it's probably different book by book.
Yeah, it is. It's very different book by book. My first books tend to have more work go into them, lots more work, because that's where I'm doing the world building. That's where I'm creating stuff. Promise of Blood, just a couple examples. Promise of Blood, I wrote a first draft. I got an agent off the first draft, but then she said, Brian, this is really good. You're a talented author, but you're also like 24 and you haven't done a lot of this before. And she made me rewrite most of the book before she would submit it to publishers. And then I did several more rewrites with the editor that I ended up with. There was a lot of work that went into that. Sins of Empire, the first book of my second trilogy in that universe, I literally rewrote the entire book from scratch because I turned a book in and my editor went, this is okay, but you're better than this. And I went, yeah, you're right. It kind of sucks. And so I rewrote the entire book. But it's funny because that rewrite is almost exactly what the published book looks like. I didn't do a lot of work on it after I did the rewrite. And it was very clean. That's kind of how all my sequels end up being, is that the sequels themselves, the world building is done. I've created the framework already. I write a first draft, and then I do very basic edits with the editor. And that's pretty much what you're going to see. I don't do a lot of rewriting after first books.
Interesting.
But first books is where most of the work comes in, I think.
I love asking authors that question because it varies from people like you who pretty much the first draft is fairly clean and it goes from there, to people who are like 5, 6, 10, 20 drafts. I don't know. a lot of rewriting. So yeah, I love that there's always such a varied response to that. Chris Fine asks, logical plot holes aside, do you feel that the lit fantasy communities zero in on historical inspiration too much? Is Westeros shouldn't have potatoes, they're from the Americas, unnecessary?
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and say I fall on the I mentioned rule of cool before. Rule of cool is my big thing. Like when I'm writing something, I really don't care if this is a Europe analog that has, potatoes.
Right.
That's one of those things that's so far down on the list of priorities in world building that it doesn't even come up. If that's something that you want to pay attention to and keep strict, then great. It's your world. Do what you want. But personally, I try to take a lot of inspiration from the real world, but I don't stick to hard rules. It's a fantasy world. That's part of why I write in a fantasy world, is so I can do whatever the crap I want. And it's it's those things are flavor. I like having my characters drinking coffee and tea because the time period feels very right for those things to be worldwide phenomenons. And some people will say, oh, if you put coffee and tea in, it feels too modern and I don't like that. And I'm like, I don't care. I like it. I like the bits of flavor that go for something that I want to add to the world. And it's all up to the writer. You can do whatever you want.
Sure. I can tell you that certainly in England, coffee and tea in that genre is completely correct. Not a problem at all. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, coffee houses as early as 1723, I think, in London. Not an issue. Darth Tater asks, what about a flint punk or black powder punk subgenre? Could this be the next step?
So punk, there's other authors that know this kind of stuff better than me. But punk is kind of like it's like the suffix that's added on to a genre when they're focusing really hard on technological advancements in that particular thing. So steampunk is all going to be, gears and steam and giant boilers and things like that. And cyberpunk is all very cerebral sort of computerized internet technology sort of stuff. So I mean, flint punk kind of thing. I mean, if you want to go in that direction, that's totally cool. I think that could be a very fun thing to explore and mine. I don't know if there's enough there to create a subgenre, but of course I would probably have said that about Steam if you asked me 50 years ago. So heck if I know.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely possible. Write it is what I would say.
Yeah, for
Genres are fluidy woody timey wimey. They absolutely are. If you think it would be cool, then write it and see what happens. Our final question for today is from Keijatan, who asks, do you have any advice for writing battles? This is an excellent question, and funnily enough, I was thinking that I need to get either one of my Hamer friends or one of my actor reenactment friends to come on and talk about battles. But yeah, I'd love to hear from a writer's perspective as well. Writing battles.
Yes, somebody like that would be really good on going into like an hour-long nitty-gritty. I'll try to keep this under 3 minutes. So for writing battles, one of the things I like to do personally is have, and I don't always do this, but when I can, I have one point of view character that is in the battle, fighting on the front lines, and another point of view character that is commanding the battle. And that can see kind of almost a bird's eye strategic view. You know, they're up on a hill or something like that. They're getting reports from messengers. That I like doing that because it provides two different perspectives. It provides the very dirty, visceral, you know, stabby, shoot sort of perspective. You know, people getting wounded and killed and just murdering the crap out of everyone around them. That's a cool perspective to have. It kind of gets the blood boiling for readers that love those big, deep fight scenes. But then if you have the other perspective, the one that's the commander, then you have, like I said, a strategic view of the entire battlefield where you can you have them seeing the ebb and sway of what's going on a bigger picture. And are there reinforcements coming in? Is that line crumbling? Is the artillery? Did my artillery battery just collapse because of a cavalry charge? There's lots of stuff that's fun to play with big picture, and flipping between those two perspectives is really fun. And you can mix those two perspectives when your commander's position is suddenly overrun by the enemy. You can play with that a lot.
Very cool. That's some great advice, and really to get those different perspectives on the same thing that's happening is such a bonus for multiple POV. Like that's multiple POV used in a really good way. And by multiple POV, sorry, I mean multiple points of view characters. So different people viewing the same event and commenting on it. It gives that a lot more dimension, essentially. So yeah, no, wonderful. All right, well, that is all we have time for today. So Brian, I would like to thank you once again for coming on to talk to us. You're so very kind.
My pleasure.
Once again, this is Brian McClellan, famous fantasy author, student Brandon Sanderson, wrote one of the most iconic Flintlock Fantasy works, the Powder Mage series, which you can check out on his website, brianmcclellan.com, where you can order one, all, or even signed copies. And you can also get the audiobooks. And yeah, if you want to have more of Brian, you can follow him on Twitter or check out his TTRPG, Typecast RPG, where you can find him as a character.
Thank you very much.
Oi, thank you. I would like to thank, of course, all of you lovely folks in the chat. If you would like to come and join us for another one of these, we will be having one next week where we're going to be talking about how to write history in your world without it becoming a giant old exposition dump. And that's for RPGs and novels and all those kinds of things. It's a constant problem. We want to make our histories interesting, but we don't want to bore our readers with them, right? So we'll be talking about that next week. And if you sit tight, we'll be going on a raid. Just before we do that, I would like to thank for the subs, Laura Bones, for the bits, Basic Dragon, for the follows, Scott Edward Nash, Bus Hungam, Alex Le Hoshi, Count Bear, and a name which has been redacted. Possibly it is naughty. I have been Janet from World Anvil. This has been Brian McClellan. That was Shadow the cat, for those of you who asked. Should have shut her out, did not, but she was very well behaved and did not decide to smarm me or get all up in my face, which is nice. And yeah, if you would like to sit tight with us, we will be going on a raid to the Great GM. He is a great GM. He is an award-winning GM. He is a screenwriting lecturer, writer, man extraordinaire, and also very, very lovely man. And if you're on Twitch, you can sit right where you are. If you are on YouTube, go to youtube.com/GreatGMLive, where you'll be able to catch up with him. And they're doing some world building. All right, folks, I think that's all from me. So enjoy the next stream. And in the meantime, grab your hammer and go world build.